Good day, everyone. Today we will explore the different theories about how a learner acquires a language, specifically the input processing theory. Before we delve into what input processing theory is, we shall first trace how input processing theory or IP theory was created. Input processing theory was actually innovated in 1993 by Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis. We call that, according to second language acquisition or SLA, language learning occurs naturally and does not require formal instruction to achieve understanding of the message. From second language acquisition or SLA, here comes Krashen input hypothesis, highlighting the significance of comprehensible input as the basis of how a language learner can exceed his current stage of language competence. However, some researchers disagree with Krashen's input hypothesis because they suggest that input can be modified or misrepresented during the course of interaction. From then on, input processing theory was developed.
Who is the proponent of this theory?
The proponent of input processing theory is Bill Van Patten. He's a professor of Spanish and Second Language Studies in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies. He is internationally known for his work in second language acquisition and second language instruction. A native of California, he has been enriched by experiences as a Latino and gay man. His time as an accomplishment academic allowed him to lecture in almost all 50 states, as well as Europe, Mexico, South America, and Australia. In the meantime, Bill works steadily on his novels and short stories, weaving gay and Latino characters into central roles, generally with surprising endings.
And what are the characteristics of this theory?
Characteristics of input processing theory. There are three characteristics for PI identified by a number of scholars, including Wang 2004, among others, which are: first is the learners are given explicit information about linguistic form or structure. Second, learners are informed by a particular IP strategy that may have negative effects on their choice of the form or structure during comprehension. And third, structured input activities due to which input is manipulated, in which particular ways to make learners dependent on form and structure to get meaning. According to Van Patten 2002, notes learners are pulled away from their natural processing tendencies toward more optimal tendencies. Other characteristics of input in terms of spoken: it is faster, phonological process, ephemeral, delivery rate are controlled by speaker or source. It is more usually redundant. While in terms of written, it is permanent, graphic presentation, delivery rate controlled by the reader, and it is also less redundant and more lexically dense.
How is input processing theory applied to learning a language? That has something to do with structuring. And what do I mean by that? That means there has to be a structured plan of the input in order to increase the rate of acquisition. And how can we do that? First, that is to teach one thing at a time. Do not overburden the student. Try to introduce only one new structure at a time in order to avoid cognitive overload. The second one is to keep meaning and focus. Students must understand to perform an activity. That means get students to notice and practice grammatical forms, but focus on the most important ones which may affect the meaning. The third one is to do agree or disagree. Learners must have something to do with the input and not just repeat. If possible, give lots of patterned input where target vocabulary and structures are repeated, and make tasks as interesting and meaningful as possible. The fourth one is to use input through written and oral. Encourage your students in your lesson plans to engage in personal level with the input. Have them to engage into public speaking and any other competition that involves writing and speaking. Now, the fifth one is sentences to context. Move from sentences to context. Work at sentence level and gradually move to longer utterances and text. You can visibly see the progress by doing that, and make sure that they have understand the sentence level before moving on into the context. And lastly, keep the processing strategies in mind. That means go back to number one. Teach one thing at a time. Keep meaning and focus. Do agree or disagree. Use input oral and written. And of course, move from sentences to context.
This is the sample activity for input processing. Van Patten clarifies that simple classroom exposure is insufficient to bring about accurate second language acquisition. So he came up with processing instruction, which he defined as pushing learners to recognize grammar in input by teaching them how to process the input. Now, there are three basic components of the PI. First is that learners are provided with explanations of grammar. Students recalled the least about the passage when instructed to simultaneously attend to the grammar and meaning when listening. Therefore, having provided grammatical explanation, teachers would then proceed to PI, providing examples where students must understand the underlying structure and grammar to capture the meaning. The second component is that learners are alerted to the problems they may encounter with the input. So, grammatical rules, subject verb agreement, or rules related to tenses are some of the difficulties found in the process of learning other languages. So, teachers must be aware of those so as to minimize the mistakes and maximize the learning process. The third component is that learners then do exercises in which they need to understand the structure in order to understand the meaning. The teacher may say, "My father had me clean up my room," then ask who cleaned the room. Now the teacher will say, "My father cleaned the room for me," and then ask the same question. Thus, processing instruction entails the teachers in enabling learners to recognize the grammar of an input in order to understand its meaning.